So welcome everyone today to Caro CC Wolfner's doctoral defense as part of the Lifespan Developmental Psychology program. The title of her talk and dissertation is Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on College Students with Disabilities or Pre-Existing Conditions, a Qualitative Dissertation. Just to sort of help orient us all, Cece is going to present for about 45 minutes.
Hope things are going well.
Then we will take questions from the public. So that is her non-committee members first, and give time for all who would like to ask a question. And then we will excuse the public and have questions from her committee. So thank you all for joining. Cece.
Thank you. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you to my chair, Dr. Lanzi, and my committee. I'm very excited to begin presenting. So thank you all. Just an overview of today. We'll be going through the background and the methods and results following the discussion. So in regards to the background, as exemplified in this quote from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought on a mental health crisis, one that has had a large and uneven impact on the well-being of historically marginalized collegiate populations. And while students have been impacted to different degrees by the pandemic, students with disabilities face additional and new challenges related to their mental health and education. For example, compared to non-disabled peers, college students with disabilities experience higher rates of isolation, feeling unsupported, job loss, depression, feelings of unsafe, financial hardships, lack of belonging, and given their pre-existing condition, have higher rate of contracting and dying from COVID. Additionally, pre-existing educational inequalities, as well as difficulties associated with education, have likely deepened as a result of the pandemic. So out of 19.7 million college students, 20% have a disability, which is around 3.94 million, although this number is likely higher due to underreporting. And although rates of individuals in college has grown over the years, only 7 to 12% of students in graduate or doctoral programs have a disability. Prior to the pandemic, students with disabilities also showed lower rates of academic success, low social and academic adjustment, as well as degree completion. As such, it's important to address the lack of data currently on college students specifically with disabilities during the pandemic, which can be argued as a continuation of the ableist and exclusionary practices in research. This brings me to the purpose of my dissertation, which was to understand the self-described impacts, mental health and academic, and coping strategies of college students and postdoctoral fellows with disabilities or pre-existing conditions during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for the purposes of conciseness, I will be using college students with disability interchangeably with college students and postdoctoral fellows with disabilities or pre-existing conditions, given it's quite a mouthful. So my aims are split up into three. The first aim focuses on the mental health impacts. The second aim regarding educational impacts. And the last focuses on coping strategies. Within each of these aims, I have sub-aims to explore whether unique patterns or themes emerge for various demographic groups. That includes racial groups, age cohort, and stage as it pertains to emerging adulthood and study classification. The theoretical and conceptual frameworks that guided this research are threefold. First, the critical disability theory, which provides a theoretical understanding of disability as it works to address the inherent ableist structures in higher education and to promote a paradigm shift in the way that disability is perceived. It also argues that disability is a socially constructed identity and interacts with various oppressive forces such as racism, ableism, homophobia, and more. And through this notion of intersectionality, this theory can help us understand how a disability interacts with other marginalized identities. For emerging adulthood, this is speaking from a developmental lens, as This is a critically sensitive time period for college students that spans from about 18 to late 20s. It's characterized by identity exploration, instability, development of autonomy, feeling in between, and hopeful possibilities of the future. This time frame is very influential for individual growth. For example, attaining education, gaining financial independence, establishing a social network are all very important developmental milestones in emerging adulthood. And these might be delayed due to the pandemic, which can be very detrimental as these tasks have been shown to increase well-being. And using these theories in combination, both advocate for qualitative research approaches, as disability is an ever-evolving construct and an emerging adulthood time period is very complex. And in order to capture the richness of those experiences, qualitative research is advocated. Lastly, I use the transactional model of stress and coping by Lazarus and Folkman to help explain the process of students coping with stressful events and their perception of how that event is, how much it is stressful to them. In addition, the incorporation of the transactional model of stress into the study will help us understand students' appraisal of stress and perception of coping as the pandemic occurred over the 2020 and 2021 academic year. So as it pertains to my methodology, I use secondary data based on a larger parent study, the COVID-19 race and student and postdoctoral mental health study, which sought to examine the varying impacts that the pandemic and racial injustices has had on UAB students, mental health, and how UAB can support their students. Briefly, this study involved a one-time all-campus survey administered in the summer and a longitudinal study of 120 students and postdocs that included a baseline survey followed by an initial in-depth interview in the fall and a final in-depth interview in the spring. It also included monthly surveys from October to April. Given the target population for my current study, any individual who had mentioned or disclosed the presence of a disability or pre-existing condition during their interview was included in analysis, and thus 36 individuals self-identified or mentioned having a disability, and that is what made up my sample. Unfortunately, 8 of the 36 did not complete their spring interview. There are various forms of qualitative research, and I will go into detail more so in the next slide regarding thematic analysis, but given I'm trying to understand a group's lived experience, that being students with disabilities during the pandemic, phenomenological research design is best fit. It involves identifying a phenomenon of interest, that being the self-described mental health academic impacts and how they coped. 2, bracketing, which involves suspending judgment of preconceived notions. This was accomplished through reflective journal writing as I collected data and analyzed data. Third component of phenomenological research is collecting data from a group of individuals who have experienced the phenomenon. Thus, this was captured at the fall and spring interviews. And lastly, involves generating themes by analyzing and combining significant statements or codes. So thematic analysis is a flexible, reflective, and powerful approach to qualitative analysis as it seeks to out finding patterns or meaning within a set of data. According to Brown and Clark, who are leading qualitative researchers, there are these 4 steps to thematic analysis. The first being familiarization with data. So for me, this involved conducting interviews, listening and cleaning interview transcripts, coding fall and spring, and also continuously cleaning and coding and doing the same procedures for my own dissertation. Second is initial coding, and since this dissertation involved secondary analysis, initial codes for the larger data set were already established. However, given thematic analysis is a very reflective process, and given my specific interest in students with disabilities, an initial code was created for any mention of students with disabilities. And third, generating initial themes. This is an active process where themes are generated from existing data. So my initial code of students mentioning disability, among others, was expanded specifically to pre-existing conditions and disabilities. And by applying sub-themes, I was able to represent various disability and pre-existing conditions to help capture and highlight the important tenets of the theme. And then lastly, reviewing, refining, defining, and naming codes. So themes already established from primary analysis of the data were compared to each data item to determine if themes were not applicable or if they held enough weight to adequately capture the students' experiences. And at this stage, I removed themes, added, reconceptualized, and combined to ensure validity of each theme. At the end of thematic analysis, a cohesive narrative is written up to best explain this phenomenon being studied, and that is the lived experience of students with disabilities during the pandemic. To kind of associate my aims with the approach, during initial interviews, participants were asked to respond to a series of 17 open-ended questions. In the spring, there were 22. These are the associated questions that I performed a thematic analysis on to adequately address my aim. In the fall and the spring, identical questions regarding mental health was asked. For aim 2, pertaining to my education, the following questions were asked and thematically analyzed. Lastly, coping. For the initial fall interview, these included questions about how students were coping, the strategies that they were coping, and how they perceived their coping, as well as describing who's their support and how they seek it. Lastly, providing an example of a time they may have needed support but did not reach out. And from the fall interview, the same questions were asked with the addition of how have your coping strategies evolved over the last year? And as it pertains to my sub-aims, in order to address this, I used cross-tabulation queries in NVivo 12, a qualitative software that allows me to cross-tabulate codes or themes against attributes, so demographic characteristics. And this was utilized to explore if any unique patterns emerged within these groups. Pertaining to my study characteristics, so the majority of my sample fell under psychiatric conditions. So this included 6 individuals who had depression solely, 3 with anxiety solely, and a combination of both anxiety and depression, which there were 9. Other conditions included the presence of a obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorder, bipolar disorder. And of those 2 who had bipolar disorder, they had comorbidities of anxiety and depression. Following this, I had 7 students with ADHD, with 4 of those individuals having comorbid conditions. In addition, there were also individuals who had asthma, 4, followed by epilepsy and comorbid asthma and multiple sclerosis. Lastly, I had 1 participant with a traumatic brain injury. Other demographics include just the overall, mainly participants had a median age of 25.64 years old and were mainly comprised of individuals who identified as female. About half of the sample were graduate students, so 17, followed by 14 undergrads and 5 postdocs. With respect to racial identity, a little over half of the sample reported their race as white, and a majority of my sample was non-Hispanic. So kind of diving into my results. This is an overview of all of the associated themes that are with each aim. And if you scan the QR code on the screen, a mobile-friendly PDF will pop up. So you're able to, if you would like, to go back and look at each of those specific themes. but I will continue to break these down. So as in regards to aim 1, by analyzing the associated questions and interview questions to understand the impact that COVID has had on mental health, 4 primary themes were identified. And within the first theme, there are 7 sub-themes, as the negative impacts were numerous, and having these sub-themes help further identify. And for time's sake, I will be talking about the most prominent endorsed themes from the fall to the spring. So as it pertains to aim 1, academic related stressors and isolation were the most impactful according to students with disabilities across the 2020 and 2020 year. Specifically, over 86% indicated that they were experiencing academic stressors in the fall, and 89% indicated this in the spring. Academic stressors included difficulties with focusing, managing workload. Students noted feeling overwhelmed and anxious due to lack of guidance. They noted that given these difficulties, the symptoms of their condition had been exacerbated. They were also stressed because they were unsure what was expected of them. And as spring continued, more individuals discussed struggles with Zoom fatigue, maintaining good grades, and having delays in research and projects. As it pertains to isolation, this was the second most impactful to students. They talked about the distress that they had experienced as they were isolated from their family and loved ones for extended periods of time. They also mentioned that a lack of social interaction intensified their anxiety related to social interaction. For example, is illustrated by a female graduate student with OCD. I'm feeling more isolated than anything, and it sucks because you don't really have anything to look forward to, and that definitely affects the mental health. So discussing positive impacts and also no impacts. At the time of the fall interviews, only 2 students had indicated that their mental health was impacted positively during COVID. And by the spring, this number increased to 8. Of the 2 who mentioned that that had a positive impact in the fall, this was pertaining to their ability to go home and be around their family. And the other student indicated that being their research involved viruses, COVID-19 presented them an opportunity to focus on that and to kind of take their mind off some uncomfortable emotions brought on by the pandemic. In the spring, of the 8 students who indicated a positive impact, they voiced that this was because they had more flexibility in their time, allowing them to relax more, pursue other interests, and grow a better sense of connection with oneself. And in regards to no impact, 4 individuals at the time of the fall interview said that COVID-19 had not impacted their mental health. And by the spring, only 1 participant had indicated this. In the fall, a female undergraduate with depression illustrated, "I'm not personally affected by the pandemic. I feel I'm a very empathetic person. And so I'm mostly concerned with the impact it has on us as a whole, as a world, particularly the US. And as it pertains to my sub-aim results in the fall, only participants who were white felt that their mental health had been positively impacted. And by the spring, all students with disabilities, except those students who identified as Black or African American, expressed experiencing positive impacts to their mental health. Similarly to Black or African American students, no undergraduate students expressed having a positive impact to their mental health at either interviews. So in regards to the last theme for identity impacts, majority of my sample fell under psychiatric conditions and followed by learning disabilities. However, it's important to note that many students, if they did not directly identify with their disability, but it was brought up later, they did identify with other groups. And through these quotes, it illustrates how disability interacts with other identities and produces different experiences. For example, in the In the spring, a postdoctoral fellow with anxiety discussed the difficulties of having an anxiety disorder and being a person of color, stating it's difficult to deal with how life is going to be like. I identify myself as a person of color, and these things do play in your mind. Having to deal with an anxiety disorder, there's always that internal question, what if it happens to me, and what if I'm at the wrong place at the wrong time? And as it pertains to mobility and sensory impairments, which include muscular MS, asthma, and epilepsy. In the fall, a student with MS and asthma, a graduate student, indicated that she does not like using her disability status as a crutch, and that it frustrates her when she has certain flare-ups. And in response, that does make her feel dumb because she feels like she cannot function. And given the stress of COVID, she believes that her health was a big part of her disability. And as I mentioned, African-American students had noted an extra level of stress given the increase in racial injustices going on during this time. Students also discussed how living in a southern state in combination with the social injustice events had negatively impacted their mental health. For example, in the, in the fall, a student with asthma illustrated that when she became aware that individuals in her group, in addition to having previous health conditions, put her at a larger risk for developing COVID, this played into her mental health and also affected the way that she was worried about her family. Lastly, 9 students with disabilities identified as being a part of the LGBTQ community, with 3 of those students indicating that this aspect had not been impacted by COVID. Of the 6 remaining, they did voice a lot of difficulties relating to their family and staying connected with their community. However, in the spring, 1 student illustrated, specifically a female undergraduate student with depression, anxiety, and bipolar, noted that the pandemic gave her time to figure herself out. And although she was able to come to terms with her sexual identity, she still had a lot of questions, which was very stressful. Aim 2, just to reiterate, is pertaining to academic impacts, which there are 5 themes, and the gradient represents the level of endorsement. And so theme 1, negative online learning experiences, was most endorsed, followed by theme 2, etc. As it pertains to negative online learning experience, students indicated that online learning was much more difficult and impacted their ability to focus. They also felt the structure of online classes did not provide the same quality education as in-person classes where they could connect with students. Specifically, at the time of the fall interviews, half of participants expressed difficulties or negative experiences with online learning. During the spring interviews, 53% indicated this. As a female undergraduate student with epilepsy, voiced her difficulty adjusting to the online format by saying, "I'm just having trouble grasping some of the material. I feel like a bunch of other students feel that way because most of my schooling has not been online until this year. It's new and it's different and it's kind of confusing. It's hard not being in a class setting because that's where I learn best, and not being around people is very stressful." When looking at sub-AIM results, younger emerging adults, so those up to 25, struggled with online learning the most, while older emerging adults, as well as grad students and postdocs, faced more difficulty with delays and setbacks in research, which is theme 2. So students noted feeling very stressed from missing out on critical program milestones, such as clinical rotation hours, further delaying important program milestones, such as graduation, dissertation defenses, and such. Students were also worried about not meeting mentor expectations and expressed feeling pressure to meet those expectations, regardless of the risk that it had to their health. For theme 3 and theme 4, theme 3 being overwhelming workload, a lot of students voiced feeling overwhelmed by the amount of work or responsibilities they had. These struggles were typically discussed alongside their negative experiences with adapting to online learning, which together impacted their academics and mental health. As illustrated by this female graduate student in the fall with ADHD, stating, I feel like I'm constantly behind and that makes me really stressed and anxious. And then that makes me less motivated to pay attention because I know I need to, I don't want to, and I just feel like I'm fighting myself about it. For learning environment challenges, this involved students discussing that working from one's home environment versus being on campus was negatively impactful in their ability to succeed in their academics and or research, and as a result felt that their mental health had also been impacted. Theme 5 being positive academic experiences. Only 3 individuals in the fall indicated that they had positive experiences pertaining to their academics. Of one of those students, they noted that they enjoyed the flexibility that online format provided them, as they could go back and pause in order to take notes to ensure that they didn't miss anything that they potentially would have missed in person. By the spring, more students began noting positive experiences or effects on their research or academics due to COVID. Most of these reasons involved that students were able to use their work as a way to keep their minds occupied from other stressors. Additionally, they enjoyed the flexibility to go back and forth between lab and home. They felt this back and forth allowed them to be more productive. And when looking at sub-AIM results, we see that out of the 20 white participants, 3 of them noted having positive experiences related to academics and research, and no other racial identity group expressed this at the fall interview. In the spring, we saw an increase in endorsement in positive experiences related to academics across all racial identity groups, except 2 participants who identified as other race. Interestingly, when looking at grade classification, graduate students also were the only ones who indicated having a positive experience with their education in the fall. So moving on to my last aim, kind of help break it down, being that there are a lot. The first 3 themes are pertaining more to the methods or strategies students engaged in to cope. Themes 4 to 6 are pertaining to how they perceive their ability to cope, and themes 7 and 9 were more focused on how they obtain support, who's a part of their support system, and then those barriers to support. So within that first bucket regarding methods of coping, there were 3: behavioral, followed by mental coping strategies, and last, relational coping strategies. So as it pertains to behavioral coping strategies, from the fall and the spring, students with disabilities engaged in hobbies the most. This included reading, watching movies, TV, playing video games, writing, exercising, spending time on social media. As a female graduate student with anxiety voiced in the fall, she started reading more self-help oriented books. Second, many students began coping by engaging in various forms of outdoor physical activities, such as walking around outside, going on runs, and finding different ways to relax in nature. Following this, students engaged in establishing a routine and structure by keeping them organized, compartmentalizing, which helped kind of diminish the stress that they had been experiencing as they were able to break down their day through tasks. As illustrated in the fall by a female postdoc with asthma, she stated, "I have to accomplish so many things in a day to feel like it's warranted that I can go home and I can do other things. Trying to do that from home was very hard, and keeping a schedule is what helped my sanity the most." And lastly, The circumstances of the pandemic in conjunction with the events related to racism and racial injustice definitely negatively impacted these students' mental health. And these events, as they played out on the news and across all social media outlets, this was very overwhelming for students. And thus, in order to cope, they decreased their exposure to television and other social media outlets. For example, a female undergraduate student with ADHD, an eating disorder, and depression noted in the fall that taking time away from social media has been helpful, and spending the past month off of Instagram was very great. In addition, in the spring, a female graduate student with MS and asthma noted that since the onset of the pandemic, by staying off news and social media, and orienting more of her content towards positive things, that helped her change and adapt to better assist with managing her mental health. For mental coping strategies, counseling was used the most across fall and spring. Many students had been engaging in counseling either through therapists or other professional helping services prior to the pandemic. But some also had began enrolling in counseling since the pandemic had started. Following this, students engaged in distraction. So students who use distraction often mentioned trying to stay busy or finding ways to occupy their mind. Some of these distractions were considered to be beneficial to students, while some other felt that it was not helpful. And then positive thinking or optimism was used not as much in the fall, but we see an increase in the spring. Students mentioned that their ability to change their frame of mind through positive thinking and looking on the bright side allowed them to feel much better about the circumstances of the pandemic. By taking time to kind of reflect on their experiences, students were able to combat negative thoughts or emotions that they had been facing. And although they were dealing with various stressors, reframing their mindset allowed them to process their emotions, see silver linings, and recognize opportunities for growth. As exemplified in a spring 2021 interview quote by a male postdoc with anxiety, he noted that with time, it was more about accepting that the pandemic is here and to stay for a while. And I tried not to feel bad all the time for things not being perfect, and having a more positive outlook has helped. In the fall, I also enjoy this quote by a female graduate student with depression who noted the importance of counting the little victories, no matter how small that they are. And lastly, students engage in spiritual or religious practices such as attending church or meditating, praying, and that helped students also decrease the stress they had been experiencing. And lastly, as it pertains to coping strategies, remaining connected with others, whether virtual or in person, provided a lot of support for students with disabilities. It helped them feel understood as their peers could relate to experiences that they were going through. They also talked about the importance of helping others as a way to cope, as that made them feel better. At the time of fall interviews, 66.7% indicated they coped by connecting with others. And in the spring, 64.3% indicated this. As exemplified in a quote from the fall 2020 interview by a female graduate student with asthma, I am coping by trying to have conversations about how I'm feeling, and for the social parts, even if it has to be over Zoom, joining clubs and stuff like that, so I can talk to other people. Now, kind of the last section of the AIM-3 results pertains, or I'm sorry, the second to last pertains to how students perceive their ability to cope. And the following sub-themes are dive more in deeper into why those students viewed their coping either satisfactory or not. So for satisfactory coping perceived being theme 4 of the AIM-3 results. At the time of the initial fall interviews, 58.33% of participants felt satisfied with their coping because of their ability to manage their stress, which is the center column. As illustrated by a female postdoc with anxiety in the fall. Since COVID, she had been diagnosed with anxiety, and by being on medication to help her slow down, that kind of helped her cope better and overall increase her well-being. Other reasons for satisfied coping was being able to accept changes. So, for example, a male graduate student with depression and bipolar disorder noted that you get these thoughts, but it's just a phase and it's going away. We need to accept it. In life, there will be many challenges, and with each challenge or phase, we tend to get better. Additionally, students felt that their coping was more satisfactory, being that it decreased feelings of isolation. Another reason was it helped them maintain normalcy. And lastly, some students indicated that their coping was successful as they were able to continue on with daily responsibilities and tasks in the same pace that it was prior to COVID. Theme 5, which is personally my favorite theme, pertains to students' abilities to, over time, continue to implement coping strategies and thus became more optimistic about the future. By considering what was beneficial for their well-being, students with disabilities kind of changed the way that they coped to better manage with the COVID-19 stressors, as well as managing their conditions or associated diagnoses. As illustrated by a female undergraduate student with anxiety in the spring, stating, "I became a different person as the year went on." I think everybody has. I don't think anyone is the same person as they were since this started. But as I grew, evolved, and learned many things, my coping strategies morphed along with it. Students also talked about how they reprioritized their mental health. As a male graduate student with anxiety illustrated, I had time to focus on my mental health, which in the past kept getting pushed aside because I was so busy with work and school. And so it gave me time to reconnect with people in my life, start therapy, start medication for anxiety. I think in the beginning, my mental health sort of deteriorated, but as time has gone on, I think I've gotten better actually. For theme 6, unsatisfactory coping, majority of participants felt that they did not have successful or satisfactory coping because of the difficulty with sustaining self-perceived adequacy and regularity. So prior to the pandemic, their coping strategies were not as effective now. Were not as effective as they were now that the pandemic had started. For example, a female undergraduate with anxiety and depression noted in the fall, I tend to be very harsh on myself. I hold myself to a very high standard, and I haven't been able to maintain that level of organization and productivity that I usually do. It has put so much stress, which has been detrimental to my mental health. Another student noted how that they were aware when their coping strategies were not being as effective or falling off, because that resulted in them neglecting various self-help basic necessities like taking a shower. Second, engaging in negative habits was perceived by students as a large reason for their coping being unsuccessful or unsatisfying. Majority of these negative habits pertain to poor eating habits, either stress eating or late night eating, just unhealthy eating behaviors in general. Third, students noted that they were unable to regulate the negative emotions they had experiencing, even with the use of coping mechanisms. And last, students noted that due to procrastination and reduced motivation, they did not feel like they were coping as adequately as they would have liked. As illustrated in the spring, a Deming graduate student with anxiety and depression said, I wish I'd been more productive and found a way to be useful to people instead of just focusing everything on finishing my degree. So the last kind of bucket is of the AIM-3 results are pertaining to avenues of support, support system, and lastly, perceived barriers to help seeking. So in regards to avenues of support, counseling was used the most. So participants sought support from counselors or other professionals in order to minimize the stress or negative emotions they had been feeling. This was followed by phone and text, as a lot of students use this to engage with others if they had family out of state, out of country, as well as relatives. And lastly, virtual platforms. So a lot of students noted that given the restrictions of social interaction, looking at other outlets like Discord and GChat, Twitter, Facebook allowed them to seek out other ways to socialize and find communities without having to risk their health. For support systems, almost every student noted that a family member was a part of their support system. So sisters, brothers, aunts, godparents, husbands, wives were noted as being a part of students with disability support systems. Second, peers also were a part of a lot of students with disability support systems. So classmates, boyfriend, girlfriend, partners, and those things. So for example, in the fall, a student illustrated that my significant other is probably the biggest support. Most of my friends who I would utilize as a support network are graduate students at UAB and other postdocs. Students also mentioned the presence of a mentor in the spring. An individual said, my PI is amazing. She's really good at prioritizing how we're doing, our well-being above everything else. And lastly, perceived barriers to help seeking. At the time of the initial interviews, 33.3% of participants indicated they did not seek help when needed because of fear of judgment, that when they did ask for help, they would be met with fear of judgment. And by the spring, 53.6% indicated this. So as illustrated in a fall 2020 interview quote by a female graduate student with MS and asthma, I don't want to let anybody down. I don't like to say I'm having a problem. I'm a whole person. I don't want to be defined by my disease, but that could be a problem. I don't like to admit that I took on too much, and that's not why I'm getting anything done. I'm exhausted and I feel like I failed. And then looking at the spring 2021 interview quote by a female graduate student with OCD, particularly the second half, she states, I never want anyone to label me like, oh, she's got so much going on, she can't finish her work, she isn't meant to be in this program. I don't want to get labeled because someone lowered their expectations. That's happened a lot, and it's been frustrating because I want to give more, but I really just can't. So this brings me to my discussion. And given that there are a lot of results, I want to just kind of talk about the most important into three parts. So college students with disabilities experienced unique compounding stressors that negatively impacted their mental health and education. Additionally, students with disability ascribe to multiple identities, shedding light on the intersectionality of disabilities as they interplayed. And from an emerging adulthood perspective, delays in important milestones and lack of in-person socialization coupled with the exasperated feelings of instability raises concern that the pandemic has hindered or impaired identity-related developmental tasks that should be occurring during this time. Second, an overarching finding was that despite the additional stress induced by COVID, over time, students with disabilities were able to tap into their resiliency and adapt more effectively. I will touch on that a little bit more in the next slide as I mapped a lot of my themes onto the transactional model of stress and coping. Lastly, although students with disabilities coped in multiple ways, stigmatizing barriers kept many of these students from seeking and obtaining resources. This is of concern given the current climate and speaks to the prominent influence that academics have on our self-view. This is also supportive of research illustrating the presence of ableism in academia. Students noted that if they were to ask for help, they would be brought with fears of negative judgment or devaluation. A lot of the time, those students internalize those feelings and blame their inability to complete certain tasks due to solely their impairment versus other social factors. And by only attributing difficulties to one's impairment, that is a continuation of the medical model of disability, which views disability as something that is less than or weak, and in order to be functioning in society, individuals need to be cured. And so that is something that is very outdated and increases the stigma and negative attitudes pertaining to disabilities. Also, given the instances of internalized stigma, which in a similar way that disability is socially constructed, adds to the research showing that self-concept is socially constructed. And so our finding that students didn't reach out because of fears of being judged negatively, these are examples of internalized stigma. This is of concern because a reduction in self-esteem, self-worth, empowerment, and community participation, in addition to hindering social support and exasperating symptomology, are just some of the negative effects of internalized stigma. I also think that social or public stigma, which is the prejudice or discrimination towards disabilities, this is related to an increased sense of isolation, which is shown in this research was a dominating stressor for college students. So kind of going back to my second point about how students were able to reappraise or reinterpret the emotional situation in a way that alters the meaning and changes the emotional impact. And according to Lazarus and Folkman, factors that can moderate or change the strength of the impact that stress would have on one's well-being, such as health behaviors, emotional well-being, and functional status. We see that acceptance of change, spirituality, quality social support, these are all factors that foster resilience, which under the moderating category within this framework is reflective of the theme that is improving over time. In addition, those themes were shown in this study, and thus it appears that the components of reappraisal, resilience, and the utilization of social support hold the potential to mitigate COVID-19 pandemics. And as such, these components should be considered when developing interventions or resources to support the success of students as they continue their educational journey. So regarding implications, as I mentioned previously, the pandemic is a mental health crisis. And so it's not only vital to provide inclusive resources, but to actively work to dismantle the barriers that we've seen that prevent students from seeking out resources when needed. In addition, this speaks to the point that language is more than just words and has a real impact on our mindsets and actions. Culture is shaped by the attitudes of administration and faculty and the lens through which disability is viewed. So to counteract common biases against students with disabilities while creating an inclusive campus culture, leaders at all levels of the institution must get involved. And with such a high prevalence of mental health problems, and as students begin to enter college and work on grappling what life is like with a disability or a mental health disorder, we need to reframe disability as a normal part of life and not something that is something to be ashamed of, a blemish or a personal weakness or a character flaw. That would be a reflection of the medical model. But if we reframe disability as a normal part of life, this is in support of the critical disability theory's most updated human rights model, and that prioritizes that disability is just a natural variation of the human experience, and most people will end up having a disability at some point in their life. So some recommendations that I would have are that universities foster opportunities for identity development, given that the pandemic has most likely hindered these opportunities, and also to foster opportunities where positive acceptance of mental health among students to counteract any impediments, like I said, on identity development. Another way to kind of help address the way that disability is perceived in education is the development of a disability-specific studies sector to properly educate students on disability history, prompting a more comprehensive understanding of disability and the use of appropriate inclusive language, which can further reduce stigma associated with disabilities. Second, given that many students were unaware of if their disability was qualified as a disability, or necessarily they directly identified with a disability, but maybe mentioned it later. As a result, I recommend development and utilization of workshops based on acceptance and commitment theory, not just to help students view the pandemic, but also their disability and mindset in a more positive light. And really honing on trying to address the ableism in academia. One way to do that is a development of a clear strategic plan, specifically for 5 to 10 years, with the aim of creating an inclusive, diverse, and accessible university. Most importantly, one that is built for policy development with quantifiable commitments. Is according to the authors of Ableism in Academia, by having what's called an equality, diversity, and inclusion ambassador. This way, we're able to take accountability in case any of the accountability measures must be put in place. For example, having an ambassador within each department to make sure strategies and protocols are being met. So for example, if a policy states that all university events such as football games or graduation need to be completely accessible, the authors of Ableism in Academia note that an ambassador will be able to determine if those commitments are met and provide sanctions if not, because no policy or vision is going to be followed through or maintained in the long term if there's no sense of enforcement. And ultimately, the aim of a comprehensive equality, diversity, and inclusion approach would make a university truly inclusive, diverse, and accessible, where gender, race, ethnicity, disability, all various identities are treated with equal respect and commitment. I would like to address some of the strengths and limitations. So there is very little research currently on students with disabilities. And thus it is to our knowledge that this is one of the first of studies that one focus on college students with disabilities in the US, and one focusing on college students across multiple semesters. And more specifically, this is the first study to do so collectively, looking across grade classifications, as well as age groups with an emerging adulthood and racial identity groups. Another strength to this study is the large quantity of qualitative data collected and analyzed. as qualitative data, although very time consuming, provides very important in-depth results that we can use to help develop interventions. As it pertains to limitations, as all studies have them, one is the diversity of disabilities in the study. So although this study was limited in the sense of diversity of disabilities, this is largely a function of the parent study, being that that was not designed to specifically target students with disabilities. And as students may not directly identify with a disability nor understand what classifies as a disability, additional context incorporated in the interview questions would have most likely led to the identification of more students with disability in the sample. Building on these points, students with disabilities often avoid participation in studies about disabilities to kind of further separate themselves from the negative connotations currently associated with disability in higher education. And thus it is likely that there were more students who we interviewed that had pre-existing conditions or disabilities, but did not feel comfortable discussing it and thus could not be identified for the study. In regards to attrition, we did lose 8, which did not necessarily impact our study population. However, it did impact the racial diversity. As of the 8 who did not complete, 4 of them were African American. And lastly, while phenomenological research origins might perceive my relationship to the disability community and this population as a weakness, given potential bias, I'm going to argue that that's a strength. Although this work is emotionally taxing and exhausting, as I am a student with multiple disabilities, given that it has really ignited my commitment to disability acceptance and inclusion, and the voices of students with disability have been silenced for far too long. And it is my hope that by using my voice and the voices of students with disabilities from this study, others can feel empowered to use theirs as well. So whether in research, policy, or other public health domains, the voices of historically marginalized communities are critical to be heard in order for society to move towards equity. And kind of echoing the stance of the disability rights movement, this work really emphasizes the importance of nothing with us without us. And so I want to thank everyone for giving me their time and listening. I also want to thank my committee chair again, my committee members, and the funding that helped support this parent study. And I also really want to thank the participants who were willing to divulge personal information, thus allowing me to share those results with you. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your guys' time.
Great job, Cece. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.